Welcome to The Ask. I am your host, Weiss Azimi, and in this episode, I'll be speaking to Palestinian-British filmmaker and artist Saeed Taji Farouky. Saeed has been producing work around themes of conflict, human rights, and colonialism since 1998. In 2011, he was awarded a Senior TED Fellowship for his work and has previously been named Artist in Residence at the British Museum and Tate, Britain. I plan to speak with Saeed about his work on his latest film, Strange Cities Are Familiar, and his role as one of the directors of the South London Gallery Film School. In his film Strange Cities Are Familiar, Saeed weaves a haunting story about memories, guilt, and resilience, inspired by the writing of Mahmoud Barghouti and his own personal experiences. In his role as an educator at the South London Gallery Film School, Saeed, Paul Crook, and accomplished film professionals and artists empower young filmmakers to explore creative filmmaking across 5 exciting sessions. Please join me on today's episode as we explore both these topics with our guest, Saeed Taji Farouky. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Ask, Saeed. It's my pleasure to invite you to this particular episode. I'm looking forward to discussing with you 2 topics, if we can get to them. You recently directed a short film called Strange Cities Are Familiar, and you are in the middle of programming and producing a film school out there in London called the South London Gallery Film School. So both topics I'm hoping to cover on this podcast, beginning with your short film. Your short film, I'm just going to give a brief synopsis for the listeners so they have some context about what they're talking about, is about a political refugee, Ashraf, who has lived in London for 30 years. Content with spending his days in his study or his local social club, one day he receives a call from his friend telling Ashraf that his son Motaz has been fatally wounded in a protest. His friend pleads with Ashraf to return home. As Ashraf struggles to return to Palestine, he recollects moments from his past and memories that are a heavy burden and a reminder of his failures and mistakes. Let's begin there with your most recent work as a filmmaker, Saeed. On process, you said you tend to be a bit more experimental in your approach, and your films are a lot more observational. So in that sense, you start with a very broad premise, and then you find a way in by examining it and moving in closer. Separately, you're on record for wanting to tell stories that are ignored, find truths that are kept secret, and challenge mainstream narratives in order to surprise audiences and complicate the simplified.
Yeah.
Following from that, what was the broad premise you started with, and what did you want audiences to find or experience as you moved in closer with this film? And what secrets and mainstream narratives are you seeking to challenge in this film, and why?
So I would say that like a lot of my films, I try and find some kind of kernel, some kind of heart in the middle of a story. And sometimes it's a scene, it's an image that I have in my mind that says something to me, that has a lot of layers to me. And, in a very, just to explain it in a very practical, functional way, I then try and build a story around that scene. Sometimes it's a scene that I witness. Sometimes it's, for example, a moment from my life. Sometimes it's just a strange image that comes to me, but somehow that image is kind of crying out for treatment in some way, crying out for creative treatment or visual treatment. And I take a similar approach to both my documentaries and my fiction. So with documentaries, I would say that beating heart of the film is more often an idea, and that's probably from my journalistic background, sort of the idea of digging deep and pursuing a concept. But I don't like making films about concepts. That's not interesting to me. I want to make films about people. And so I spend a lot of time researching a concept and trying to figure out how I can weave that into a story, or how that concept can be embodied in a person. And with Strange Cities Are Familiar, like a lot of my work, it came from another piece of work that I'd never entirely finished. There was a play that I was writing a few years ago that had sort of been commissioned by a festival, and then the festival sort of ceased to exist. So this thing never got made. But the central theme, the central moment in this play was that there were Arabs in exile living in London in a cafe in West London, and the sort of Arab community that I was familiar with. And they're discussing the politics of Egypt at the time. And then they discuss protest in Egypt and someone who got injured in a protest in Egypt. And then this kind of very dramatic, operatic, magical realist moment occurs where that protest suddenly bursts in through the door of the cafe. And it was written as a immersive theater. So the audience would go into a cafe and sort of overhear these actors, saying their lines, and then this kid would come in through the door injured, and that would set off this chain of events. And then if I go even further back, central to that image was an image from Murid Barghouti's I Saw Ramallah, his sort of very creative autobiography in a way. I guess it's sort of like a psychological autobiography about his life in exile and returning to Palestine for the first time after 30 years away. And he describes an event where one of his relatives, he was living in exile, I think somewhere in Eastern Europe, I can't remember, maybe it was the Czech Republic, but one of his relatives collapsed in a train station. He was basically having an aneurysm or a stroke. And everyone around him thought he was drunk, and so they ignored him. And so there was this very moving, disturbing image of a man stumbling through a train station and everyone sort of being afraid of him and ignoring him and leaving him to die on his own. And that's really how I work. And I come up with that central moment or motif, and I build a story around it without really worrying too much about plot, to be honest. I mean, plot is very secondary to me. And so a lot of those layers come from my own experiences and experiences of my families. And I basically, around that central event, I fill in the rest of the journey, whatever it is in that story.
Thank you for that insight, Saeed. Returning back to your work as an artist, on style, you've said that you go into situations with a huge amount of sensitivity and sympathy and work very slowly. Your films tend to be about quieter people, or people with a public persona and a very private persona on the other side.
Yeah.
How did this style or approach of yours apply in the making of this film? And certainly it does appear in both, I think, the approach you took and your main protagonist. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that sort of angle you approach your work with, your interest in story and character.
Yeah, sure. I think that comes from my documentary background, and I guess as part of my interest in telling stories that aren't usually told, for me, one of the ways of doing that is that you ignore the loudest person in the room. I think it's very easy, and most of the commercial documentary world is based around, telling a story about the loudest voice in the room. I just find that a bit obnoxious, and I find it very simplistic and usually not surprising. And those kinds of people don't necessarily interest me. And I also find it sometimes just a bit too easy, because those documentaries can often look like almost like a freak show. It's like this idea that if you find an interesting, loud personality, you can hang a film on their shoulders and they just carry us along without having to worry about anything else like a structure or journey or psychology. And so my interest is always, well, what's happening to the people, the voices that we're not hearing? And that transferred very much to my work as a journalist. When I would cover a conflict, I would really just ignore the mainstream narrative. We've heard the whatever British Ministry of Defense's perspective. We've heard the perspective of the militias in Iraq, but what about, individual people, for example? What about the quiet people that we don't hear from? So that whole approach comes from that. And it's also, although I would say my films have a very specific look and style, and I have very clear ideas of how I want my films to look and feel, I'm very passive when I'm directing. And that's just because I also consider myself a very quiet person, so I like to sit in the corner and observe for a very long time, and through that establish a kind of a very close, trusting relationship with the people I'm working with. But it also means that naturally I'm also attracted to filming with other quiet people, and so the stories unfold very organically. So, for example, on Strange Cities, working with Mohammed Bakri, who is quite an internalized actor. And the majority of his acting in that film is psychological. There aren't many lines. There's a lot of very quiet moments where he has to reflect circumstances, but without saying anything. So it becomes a very it becomes a very internal process. And that's the kind of actor he is, and that was what initially attracted me to him. And so it's I like to tell the story in a way that reflects the way I see the world, and it's usually like that. I sit back, I watch for a very long time. I don't consider myself very reactionary, but when something happens that sets me off, I can explode. So that's how I structure my films. They're a reflection of my own personality.
So, returning back to your own personality and how that shows up in your work as an artist. Once again, in a previous interview, when talking about your process of filmmaking, you said that the chaos of the creative process doesn't bother you so much because that's, in fact, how you see the world. Your experience of every day is quite fractured and quite episodic. And returning back to how this applied in your short, Strange Cities Are Familiar, the film is at times dreamlike with a fragmented narrative. Your character, Ashraf, appears lost in the city and lost in his memories. Is that why you chose to have a non-linear narrative for this film? Or did you have another reason for applying a non-linear approach to the storytelling of this short?
Well, it really is. I love the nonlinear structure in cinema and fractured films, but I've never tried to consciously reproduce that. It's just that, like you said in that quote, I really experience life as very fragmented and often very disconnected. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, if you want to get into the psychology of it, I'd be happy to talk to you about why that's the way that I see the world. But I mean, to make a long story short, I went through a very long period of trauma when I was growing up. And one of the consequences of having a traumatic childhood is that, of course, you see the world in a different way. And very often memory is affected. That's a huge issue for me, is that I have a terrible memory anyway. And so things tend to feel a lot less connected than they are. But also certain experiences are suppressed and certain experiences get heightened. So my recollection of my childhood is very patchy, and I think I have some memories that to me are very clear and vivid but are probably false. And I think there are some significant moments in my life that I have completely forgotten, and that's all pretty standard for someone who suffered trauma. So when I make films, I don't consciously set out to say, how can I be provocative and break this linear narrative? I just don't have the capacity for linear narrative. And I always say that the reason my films are very often nonlinear or not so clear in their narrative structure is that I'm just terrible with narrative structure. I can't, there's an editor I work with, for example, Gareth, who's been a good friend of mine and editor for years. And really, when we're on a film together, I could have been cutting it for 3 months and I still have no idea what order the scenes are in or what leads to what or what was a consequence of what's going to happen if we move this scene here. And it really becomes the main responsibility of the editors that I work with is to keep track of that structure, because I just cannot get my head around it. And so instead of really struggling over and over and over again to try and replicate, a more traditional 3-act structure, I just reflect the way that I see the world. It's very organic to me. It's not, and it can be difficult because often, say, when you're trying to fund a film or market it or whatever, there's an impression that, people make films like this, let's say art house films, less obvious films, less clear films, to be specifically provocative or confusing or obtuse. But it's really not for me. It's just how I experience the world. And so that seems perfectly natural to me.
I would like to return back to your personal biography in regards to this short film. You, as a filmmaker at this point, Saeed, you have a diverse range of credits as a director, all the way going back to 2007 with your first documentary short, Tunnel Trade.
Mm-hmm.
However, I would argue that this short film is, from what I can tell from your filmography, maybe your most personal. From what I understand, you have Palestinian, Egyptian, and British heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And this film was based on many experiences in your own life and the lives of your parents. Apart from the story you were trying to communicate to the viewers of this film, how did the making of this film address your own personal history and biography?
Well, I would say I mean, you're right that in a biographical sense, this is the most personal. Oh, well, actually, to be honest, I made a film in 2013. This sort of experimental.
The Runner?
No, it was just after The Runner. It was called "There Will Be Some Who Will Not Fear Even That Void," and it's a magical realist documentary. That's what I consider it. I would probably say that was the most directly autobiographical, because we had a plan to make a sort of art documentary about a group of artists on a boat. We were essentially, me and some friends were accepted onto a residency on this sailing ship that sails around the Norwegian Arctic.
For
And
real.
so, yeah, yeah, and it's an amazing experience, and I mean, terrifying for people for people who aren't used to being on the high seas. It's an incredible sense of isolation and fear and vulnerability, but also very beautiful to be out there. Anyway, we had a team of four, and we each had a very specific role, and this documentary had a real structure to it. And then slowly the three others dropped out for various reasons. So I was left on my own. And in August of that year, my mother died, and then the residency was in October. So I was making this film just 2 months after my mother died, and it became a real, in a way, an elegy about her life. Elegy. I never know how to pronounce that word. It became a sort of an ode to her. It became about my relationship with her, and her relationship with her history and her family and my family, but in a very obscure way. So I would say underneath the surface, that's the most autobiographical. But you're right that Strange Cities Are Familiar is the most, in terms of narrative structure, narrative, let's say, the story, most directly influenced by my family and my experiences. And in the sense that it's about living in exile, which is really the story of my family as Palestinians. I mean, in many ways, it's a sort of imagined alternative history of my father's life. The
Yeah,
sort
could you
of
tell me a little bit about that family history?
Yeah, well, my father's side of the family is Palestinian, and they're all refugees from 1948. So they were forced out when Israel was created at gunpoint, and ended up in various places. I mean, my father was born in Damascus, and they moved around the world a lot, and he ended up in Cairo as a teenager. That's sort of where he spent most of his childhood, and that's where he met my mother, who was Egyptian. And so my father and my mother then moved to the UK, and I was born here. I was born in the UK, and they did that very deliberately, because they wanted a kid who had a foreign passport, because they had seen and experienced what life was like with Arab passports or with no passports. In my dad's case, when he was born, and so they really longed for some kind of stability. And for my father, that was really his reason for being, was to give his children stability. He wasn't very politically engaged. He didn't raise us to be very politically engaged. I sort of reached this political perspective on my own very much, and through my family in ways, but very much on my own. I think my dad would have preferred us to just have easy, stable lives and not be engaged with Palestinian politics. So that's the sort of, that's the background that I approach the film from. And so in a way, Ashraf is an interpretation of what my father's life could have been. That's the way I've always seen it.
I would love to have a chance to take a look at your short film from 2013. There will be some who will not fear even that void. What a beautiful way to pay tribute to your mother. Where could someone catch that film if they wanted to seek it out?
That you can, like the other films on my website, you can buy them all through Vimeo. So we just self-distribute through Vimeo on demand. And that one it's not really a short. I mean, it's 52 minutes, so it's not a feature length, but it's a TV hour. And it's weirdly, I mean, I feel like it's probably the most cohesive film I've ever made, even though it was made with just 10 hours of footage, and we edited it and finished it in 5 weeks, I think. I mean, the whole process was pretty fast, but somehow it's the most kind of elegant distillation of my ideas. And since then, I've really been trying to get back to that style of filmmaking. And I think with the documentary I'm working on now, I've finally returned to that, much more personal and reflective style of filmmaking.
I would look forward to hearing more about your latest documentary when you're able to share more with the public. Returning back to our most recent discussion about Strange Cities Are Familiar and your father, your character Ashraf throughout the short has flashbacks to his life in Palestine. And all those flashbacks are tied to trauma or pain. Is there a reason why that is how Ashraf recollects his Palestinian heritage, and how is that tied to your understanding of your father?
Well, I think that a lot of us, and you don't need to be Palestinian to have this experience, but it is very vivid in the Palestinian experience. But a lot of us experience a collective trauma and an inherited trauma. And of course, it manifests itself in various ways. But for me, I would say I spent the majority of my life without a distinct sense of my identity, because I was born here and I've been in the UK for more than half of my life now, but I don't very emotionally consider myself British, certainly not in any kind of nationalistic sense. Whereas I feel Palestinian as a character, as a personality, as an identity. But when I'm in Palestine, I don't feel an emotional connection to it, because I never grew up there, and most of my family has been kicked out since 1948. When I'm in Cairo, I feel an emotional connection because my family was all there for the longest time, and that's where I remember family reunions, for example. But what that means is that my experience was very unmoored and undefined, and with competing identities, in the sense that my father might have encouraged us not to consider ourselves Palestinian when we were younger, but my grandmother, his mother, was completely the opposite. That whenever she would visit, she would tell us that we should be proud of being Palestinian and understand that heritage. And so all of those identities were always clashing and competing and confusing me. And the film for me is just several ways of manifesting that. So that's the kind of psychological or spiritual explanation for the various strands of Ashraf's identities that intersect in various ways. And that for him also manifests itself physically in this dementia. He's an older man who's going through dementia, and that dementia means that memories collide and clash, and the past kicks down the door of his present and challenges him. And he has to learn to live with it, or he has to learn to accept that that's now his future. And that's very much inspired by my mother's experiences with dementia. When she was, well, in the last sort of 10 years of her life, it became much more acute. But she had the habit of creating false memories, or remembering things in completely different ways, or not remembering things that happened. And she would have visions, and she believed in ghosts, and all this way of seeing the world, which was completely the opposite to a kind of rational scientific view of our existence. It was a very spiritual approach. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that on the one hand was a very beautiful and poetic way of seeing the world and interacting with the world, and it opens you up to so many new encounters and experiences. But at the same time, it's a way of experiencing the world that's totally disconnected from reality. It's totally impractical. It can be dangerous. It's irrational. So my films are somewhere in between those two paths of experiencing life.
So interesting. So in a way, Ashraf is not just sort of a reference or inspired by your father, but is actually a combination of your memories and understanding of both your parents, your mother and your father.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And even his experiences, I would say, reflect the experiences of both my parents, as well as their parents' generation, and the guilt and shame that I think a lot of Palestinian grandparents feel because their homeland was lost, their homeland was taken away. And there is a sense with some families, mine included, that maybe we didn't fight enough. we flee to save our lives, of course, understanding that you'll come back. But when you realize that you can't come back, then suddenly you start to question whether you should have fought instead of fleeing, whether it's better to die with dignity than it is to live in shame or regret.
Returning back to the making of this film, could you tell us how you went about casting this short, and how did you eventually settle on your amazing lead, Ashraf? For Ashraf, Mohammed Bakri just commands the screen. I'd like to learn how you put together your cast for this short.
There was no option. I wrote the part for Muhammad, and if he hadn't done it, we wouldn't have a film. So I wrote it for him. I asked people who could get me in touch with him, and then I was terrified because I've never made a film like that before. I made shorts when I was in university, so that was in 1996, 97, 98, but they were never on that scale. And I was terrified that someone like him, who's an artist, who's a serious filmmaker, who has been working, I don't know, maybe 50 years in the industry, would see the script and just find it laughable. But thankfully he liked it and he agreed and it worked out. But I mean, we just hung everything on him. If he hadn't accepted, or he couldn't take the role, or the country didn't give him a visa, which was also a potential problem, then we'd probably have no film. That's an easy answer to that question about casting. The other roles, I mean, there were a few friends of mine who I knew had an incredible presence that I wanted to be in the film, and many of them aren't actors.
I love the travel agent personally.
Oh, I like him. Yes, he's amazing. That was through another film that I watched that I found absolutely beautiful, and I just contacted the cast of that film and tried to get them into my film. So that was also fairly easy. With Suad, for example, who's Ashraf's wife in the flashbacks, she's a dancer and a singer. And for me, I'm really looking for a presence. I don't necessarily need someone who's a trained actor. It's just somebody who, especially for that role, who can command that kind of attention when you're staring into her eyes, and who can convey this sense of both strength and hurt. And similarly with Daniela, who's the caretaker, Ashraf's caretaker, she's a friend of mine who I'm hoping can work on other films with me. But she's not a trained actress either, and she just has a presence, a sort of a way of being that I find fascinating, and a way of standing that's very unself-conscious, and it's quite rare for people to be unself-conscious in front of camera. And it's something I'm always absolutely fascinated, I would say bordering on obsessed with, because I'm incredibly self-conscious, and I'm never comfortable in front of a camera or with people looking at me or photographing me. And so when I see someone who just inhabits their body in a way that's so natural and pure, or on a more dramatic end of the scale, someone like a dancer who has so much mastery over their body and coordination and so much confidence in movement, I find it incredibly moving. So there are always, I'm always looking for moments in my films that feel almost like dance sequences, these sort of choreographed human moments that I find really emotional, mostly because I just don't have that kind of coordination. I find it so mysterious. It's like another world, it's a very spiritual experience for me to imagine what it's like to have that kind of mastery over your body.
Now, speaking of dance and dance-like movements in your work and how you're drawn to that in your storytelling, watching your short film, I was struck with how you approach the composition of your frame and the movement of your camera through your scenes. Could you tell us about how you collaborated with your cinematographer, Diana Oliferova? Please correct me if I pronounced her name wrong. How did you collaborate with Diana to arrive at the look for your film?
We started with a lot of references, and that's quite an easy process for me. Because I'm really, my way of working is very research based. Even for extremely creative projects, maybe that might have no basis in reality at all, I still have that kind of journalistic approach from my past as a journalist. And I feel like a magpie when I'm working. I just love collecting bits of, scraps of paper and images and sounds and lines, and I sort of make these webs of connections where I find an image here and I realize that, that filmmaker was influenced by this painter, and this painter was influenced by this sculptor, and then you realize that the filmmaker made a film with that sculpture in the background, and that becomes a reference. So these webs of influences that I find fascinating. So it was through collecting a lot of images, reference images. And then it was through simplifying. I wanted everything to look almost real, but there's always a sense of strangeness in all of those images. And that really comes through building a set, or dressing a set in our case, because we were on location. And then adjusting things just slightly so that they no longer feel natural, right?
Yes,
And that
speaking of that, there's a very, I mean, the way your short begins is, the reality of your storytelling is quickly broken in that first scene in the cafe when this news from Palestine invades the cafe, and Ashraf is confronted with the wounding of his son. But there is a wonderful scene in your film where Ashraf is walking through the streets of London, and he hears something through a door, and he turns towards it, and the next shot that you see is this very dreamlike, almost fantasy-like sequence where Ashraf is descending down into his memories of Palestine and his lost wife or partner and his son.
Yeah, I think very often what I also do is I just copy scenes from films, and I'm always amazed that nobody notices that much. I mean, I'm a huge fan of references and inspiration, and sometimes I do something that is so obviously a ripoff just because, sometimes you see something, if you see a scene from a film and it's so clear to you that there's no better way of doing it. And, when it comes to your film, what you think, instead of reinventing the wheel, I might as well just do that thing again. And luckily, it's so out of context that no one has ever noticed any of my blatant ripoffs. But they are there. And sometimes they become so integrated into the film that, years later, like, I'll have a conversation like this and I'll be saying, oh, I wanted to express the isolation of him through a physical manifestation of his psychology, and I completely forget that I just ripped off the scene from Tarkovsky's Nostalgia, for example, and it becomes so internalized that I forget about it and I absorb it, and maybe that's the best way of being inspired by other artists. But yeah, that scene for me was really just a ripoff of Tarkovsky's Nostalgia. A man walking through the streets, and the way the sounds layer, and the way that the sounds become his memories, and the way they're integrated into his memories. And once he enters the sort of warehouse that then becomes this refugee camp, that was really just something I like doing often in films, also in my documentaries, where you sort of poke the audience in the eye every once in a while. So that's why I wanted everyone to turn to the camera, because it implicates us as the audience, but also it just introduces another layer of complexity with Ashraf, because suddenly you ask yourself, can they see him? If he's remembering something that happened 30 years ago or 40 years ago, how can they see him? How is he interacting with his past? But that's really just a reflection of my experience with memories, that we can remember things in a particular way that will influence how we act, and then how I act today becomes a memory, and that then influences how I act again in the future, and it becomes this virtuous or vicious circle. And the more fiction that's integrated into that influences the trajectory of our lives without really knowing it, without understanding how or why. It's like the film I'm working on now is very much influenced by Buddhist philosophy, because it's about a Buddhist family, and the system of karma is incredibly complex, and in a way very beautiful, and in another way very overwhelming. But it's things that you've done in your previous lives that not only determine how you will be reborn, but how you act in this life. And the way you act in this life determines how you will be reborn in your future lives. So it's this very complex system of influences that is really impossible to follow, I would say, but gives us both hope and frees us, because so much of it is determined by something that you have no control over. That is what you did in your past life. And that made a lot of sense to me because of because of my relationship with memories.
Films can transform significantly. Speaking of memories, from what you wrote down on paper and shot on set or in the field. But when that footage hits the editing room, it can often change. So I'm curious as to, I know that you've worked with this editor several times, Gareth Coe. How do I pronounce his last name?
Kyo.
Keo.
Yeah.
What did Gareth bring to this documentary in the way of taking those memories and taking those moments that you captured on film and putting it together into this mosaic that we as viewers watch?
You're talking about Strange Cities now?
Correct. Sorry. Yes, of course, because
Yeah.
you had worked with him on a number of documentaries. I am talking
Yeah.
about Strange Cities.
I think for me, Gareth is sort of this. I mean, he's incredible with structure, and I think that's why I love working with him. Is his sense of how different pieces influence each other, and in a way that I can never get my head around, and I'm terrible with. And I feel like sometimes those things don't necessarily matter. If you can watch a film and suspend your rational thought and you just experience it in a linear way, and the order of things don't necessarily matter if you have the overall feeling of the film. I mean, that's how I've always approached my films. But you can only really do that if you have a mastery of structure. And so that's what Gareth has always brought. That's, I think, his incredible skill, is having this sort of overview of each element's influence on the other, and then more importantly, what happens if you start to move things around. I feel like I have a good sense, for example, of pacing, and maybe that's because I'm also a musician. I was my mother was a musician, and so my sister and I were raised to take piano lessons and then violin lessons, and music was always there. And my mother was very into the French crooners, so like Aznavour and Edith Piaf, and she was into classical, Egyptian music like Kulthum and that kind of thing. And there are two schools that are very emotional. That their work is based very much on this kind of overt, very profound emotional expression through music. And I think what you get by being raised in a house where that kind of music is playing is this sense of pacing, and how the music carries you through the quiet parts and then punches you in the face, with the loud parts. So that's an aspect of filmmaking that I feel very comfortable with. The structure, not so not so much. Yeah, does that answer your question?
It does, and I actually have a question, based once again on your biography of being surrounded by music and your mother's love for a certain kind of Arab and French music.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the film, you start with an almost genre trope with the soaring vocalization at the beginning of your short film, Strange Cities. And you drop into the first shot of your film, and what the viewer sees is a group of men singing to each other. Was that kind of a way of starting your film with a little bit of humor? I personally smiled when when I was watching that scene.
That was really one of those things that just, when I get an image that's very clear to me that this is necessary. That was really one of those. And what I often do, and I'm doing it right now in this interview as well, is that I sort of retroactively justify my decisions. I mean, sometimes I might come up with something completely unrelated or random, but it just seems so vital to me. And then, of course, in a funding application, or when the producer asks, or in an interview, I can say, well, it's a choir of men, and a lot of the film is about masculinity and the male identity. And so that sort of bond that a choir of men has, doing an activity that may not be considered a very macho activity, this kind of traditional folk singing, and the fact that it's polyphonic, and polyphonic singing requires really a high degree of harmony, which means you need to understand where the other musicians are coming from and understand their vocalizations and understand their pacing and their tone. So it's this beautiful sort of group dynamic that works very well together, and that's a perfect counterforce to Ashraf, who is very alone. Although he can be a really social man in a group like that, when he goes home, he's utterly alone, and that really highlights the difference. And that's all probably true, but also the fact is that I heard this Georgian choir, and I was just absolutely convinced that it needed to be in the film, and so we put it in the film. And I think it works in a very strange way, even though it shouldn't work because it doesn't make any sense. But I don't really care as long as it, as long as it, there's cinema logic and there's real world logic, and if both were the same, there'd be no reason to make films.
I loved it. I think I would have stopped watching your film right away if you just dropped into that shot of the cafe and had not seen that Georgian choir. But because they were there, I was like, all right, I'm sold. I'm in for the rest of the ride.
Oh, great. And it's also, talking about this idea of masculinity, which I'm really fascinated by, and it sort of threads through a lot of my work. The tune in particular is also one that I chose, but I mean it is a very typical Georgian folk song. It's called Tamar Kalo, and it's about a famous queen from Georgian history, folklore, who represented herself as a king in order to be able to rule. So it has this very interesting dynamic of, again, how men express their strength and what we expect of men, and therefore what our expectations of women are. And that's really something, especially in Ashraf's character, his inability to embrace his vulnerability and accept his weaknesses is a big part of why he still lives in guilt, why he still feels guilt. So, there are a lot of really subtle things that are related, but it's also just an aesthetic choice that kind of polyphonic singing I just find incredibly beautiful. I have a similar relationship to it that I do with dance. It's something that just moves me to tears when I watch it, but mainly because I just can't understand the level of skill that's required to achieve that. And it's something, that I don't have. It's sort of a mixture of awe and envy and fear at my own lack of coordination. So it's just a style. It's going to appear in my next film as well. It's just a style of music that I adore.
I love how each of your devices that you included in your film have multiple potential meanings. I had no idea that we were in fact listening to a Georgian choir. I didn't recognize the language the men were singing in, and I certainly didn't realize that there was a meaning to the song as well, and about this queen. In a way, it's a nod to Ashraf's long lost partner, who does come across as a tragic queen in those flashbacks.
Yeah, that's something I'd never thought of, but that's very true.
So
Yeah.
behind, as you would know, behind every skilled director, there is often a skilled producer, and they wield enormous influence over the making of a film. Could you please share with us how you connected with your producer for this short, Maria Karuna Galizia? Did I pronounce her name correctly?
Yeah, Maria Caruana Galizia.
How did she support your production for your film as your producer?
Well, yeah, I mean, Maria, and I'm still working with her now. We're developing a feature film together. She's just been a godsend. I feel incredibly lucky that I met her and that I could work with her. We met originally. I was commissioned to make a really short film for Channel 4, sort of short fiction film. And as part of that commission, they suggested some producers that I might want to work with. And we just had a few Skype interviews with a few of them, and I got along really well with Maria, and particularly I think we had a similar way of seeing the world, in the sense that our politics aligned very well, and we wanted to make the same types of films. These maybe challenging, maybe art house, you could describe it as that, films that are not so straightforward, that not driven by commercial interests, and also films that tell stories that aren't normally told. And so we made that short together, and I think our working method together is fantastic, and it's very mutual. In that, like any great, I think any really good relationship with a producer and a director, they rein you in when you think you're the greatest artist in the world, and 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 they give you hope when you think your project has fallen apart, you know, and they manage to run the entire film at the same time. So it's an incredible skill that I'm in awe of. And we both bring our own experiences, our own life experiences into our films as well in a very personal way.
Let's talk about the financing of a film. This is a very important part of the process of making a film, whether it's documentary or whether it's fiction material, is securing the backing to make it. How were you able to put that together for this film?
That one actually, it's a rare instance where I got mainstream British national film funding. So that one we actually got through the BFI and Creative England, which is our public film funding body, the main national film funding body. And then we also got some additional money through an organization called AFAC, the AFAC, the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, which is an incredible independent organization based in Beirut that does amazing work funding, you know, much more radical experimental work, and work that would never get national funding from Arab countries. So they're amazing. They're an incredibly supportive group. And it's the only time, I mean, I generally don't expect to get British national film money because my priorities, especially these days, they don't align very well with it. I mean, I would be happy to be funded by them, but I've also reached a point where I certainly don't expect it and I don't count on it. So, for example, the documentary I'm making now is a European co-production. It wouldn't even qualify to apply for British national money because it's not quote unquote British enough. So you know, it's a French, Palestinian, Dutch, Swiss co-production. And that's also the work of another incredible producer called Estelle Robin-Yu, who I started working with on The Runner, and then we teamed up again for this film, and she's just worked tirelessly to give it the space that I think it needs. It's another really long, you know, we've been making it for 4 years, incredibly slow process where, you know, we just found an interesting person, and we knew there was a film there, but there was no story. And so, you know, I don't care because I'm not beholden to story, but you know, most funding is. So it's a very long process of trying some approaches, editing, showing some more footage, getting a bit of support, coalescing that with other support, and then going to bigger organizations, and also just working with organizations that are more interested in funding experimental or less traditional projects.
I understand. Well, you are fortunate in the sense that you were backed for this film through those funding bodies, and you are also fortunate for benefiting from the public funding of arts in Europe. We, unfortunately, here in the United States, while we have some very important funding bodies, it's nothing to the extent of public funding for the arts in Europe. So you and your colleagues out there, very glad that you can turn to that for films that might not necessarily be seen as screaming commercial, you know, box office products.
Yeah, yeah.
And going back to the difficulty with documentary, especially, one question that I'm frequently asked, and I'm sure you know you've had to deal with this too, is how does your documentary end?
Sure, yeah, yeah,
You just look at the person and you think, oh my God.
yeah. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, I hate that question, but it comes up all the time in funding applications, and a lot of it has to do with, I mean, I have a very antagonistic relationship with the documentary industries in general, but you know, let's say we're in a moment where it's called a golden age of documentary, but what that really means for most people is that documentaries are now commercially viable and they make money in a way that they didn't before. You know, that's not a mark of success for me, and it doesn't represent a high point in the industry. It does mean that there's more interest in documentaries, and that's a positive. But what it also means is that documentaries are judged as products much more, and they're judged also by the very traditional criteria of fiction filmmaking, and particularly 3-act narrative structure fiction filmmaking, which is a straitjacket that cinema doesn't need, but it's often required by a lot of people. And what ends up happening is you make very predictable documentaries. You know, the majority of that industry is very predictable. It's biopics of people who are already dead, so you know their story. I mean, that's the biggest and most lucrative strand of documentary filmmaking. Or it's very predictable story arcs, a sporting event where they either win or lose, an election where they either win or lose, whatever it might be. And there are some great films made about those things, obviously, but the expectation is that you'll know the ending, and that's how they fund, based on the conclusion of the story. My films often don't even have a story, so my approach is that the film needs to conclude, but the story doesn't end. So in other words, the film is a window on the larger story. And as long as your film as a unit, as a piece, as a product of storytelling, has some kind of satisfactory conclusion, we can understand that the story behind it never really ends.
Saeed, to start with, I would like to thank you for taking us through Strange Cities Are Familiar. I think it's a wonderful short film, and I certainly hope that anyone listening to this podcast takes the time to seek out your short film. You said it's available off your personal website or Vimeo?
Well, actually, that film is not, it's not online yet. We do want to release it very soon, so I can't tell you when, but because it's pretty much done with its festival run, we'll just put it online at some point for free. So I don't know where or when, though. So for now, it's still not available, unfortunately. I mean, except for the festivals that it's still playing in.
Well, I'll certainly share the trailer that is publicly available. And as soon as the film is released, wherever you decide to release it, I'll be sure to try and push it out through the accounts for this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to take a moment to move over to sort of the other aspect of your persona as an artist. And I think it's very rare and very special that a working filmmaker such as yourself dedicates themselves to training the next generation of aspiring filmmakers. And that's exactly what you are now doing with the South London Gallery Film School. And
Yeah.
I understand that for a number of years, you've been working with several people at SLG, including right now Paul Crook,
Yeah. Yeah.
on this film school effort. How and why did you choose to get involved with managing this film school? And why has it been sometimes described as a radical film school?
Well, it was another, I would say, lucky kind of fortuitous meeting that the gallery had been running a sort of film course for a few years, but it was much more about how to use a camera and how to make, I would say, more conventional films. And the school wanted to try something different, and so they asked someone that they had worked with before, another filmmaker, a good friend of mine called Joseph. And they said, who do you think would be someone that, good to run the school and to take it in a new direction? And he very kindly suggested me. So they brought me in and spoke to me, and I pitched this idea of a radical film school that's not only radical in form, in the sense that we wouldn't focus on conventional filmmaking or commercial filmmaking, but also radical in its approach, that it's not really a film school. I mean, we call it a film school because it's the easiest way to explain it, but it's about showing people that there's another way of telling stories visually, and it's about supporting filmmakers that are from backgrounds that are really overlooked or ignored by the industry. Politically, it's very radical in the sense that we take a really unconventional and non-commercial approach, and we encourage the political activism and political voices of our students, or our participants now. So it's sort of morphed over the years. This is our 6th year now, and particularly because we have to run it online this year, it's become even less like a conventional film school. So we'll have units like looking at folklore is something that we're focusing this year, so that people bring stories of their own folklores, their own cultural folklore, and I mean that in the broadest sense. Whether it's someone who lives in East London, there will be a folklore of East London. There'll be a local mythology of East London. There'll be an oral history tradition from that culture, and looking at how those styles of folklore influence our types of our approach to storytelling. So it's really, in many ways, it's very amorphous. It doesn't have a strict schedule. It doesn't have modules that build on each other. You could very easily come away from the school still not knowing how to make a film in a practical sense, but we believe that that's the easiest part. I don't focus on camera because how to operate a camera is never the hardest part of making film.
I
I
would
think.
also point out that, I mean, it's so very astute for you and the programmers to recognize how the practical approach to filmmaking is not necessarily a valuable educational product in the days of YouTube. I mean, if you wanted to sort of self-educate yourself on using a camera, using editing software, or learning the technical aspects of filmmaking, it's readily available out there for the dedicated student for free. So I think that
Exactly.
I think that moving past the sort of the usage, teaching the usage of the equipment, and more on helping artists with their thought process in regards to their own work is
Mhm.
far more valuable. And I think that's what you're saying, that it's sort of the focus of the school at this point.
Yeah, I think it's more valuable, and it's also, it's an attempt to challenge the industrial model of film school, and that model is it's paid mostly. They become, for example, our film school, our national film school here is incredibly expensive. So that already determines the kind of people that can go. But its mission, and like most film schools, its mission is to prepare you to be an employee in the film industry as it exists today. Well, firstly, I'm not interested in reproducing the film industry as it exists today, so I'm not going to ask people to prepare for that. But secondly, the film industry has completely collapsed because of this pandemic, and before that, the changing finances of film production. So now we're really at a point where we can either just sort of bury our heads in the sand and pretend that we still need to prepare people for the film industry that existed in 2019, or we realize that we have the opportunity to completely rebuild it, completely refocus its priorities, give other people a chance to participate in it, produce maybe a parallel industry that has no interest in making commercial products. And that's what we do. And most importantly, even this educational, because it's much more, I feel, I consider myself a facilitator more than a teacher. It's about connecting ideas rather than telling the participants how to do things. But what was I going to say?
Oh, I think that that's very
I
well
lost it.
said, and that can happen with an
Mm.
erudite speaker such as yourself. Going back to this particular program, I'm very interested in it. I understand that it's held over 5 or 6 days, and each edition of the film school aims to provide your participants a broad overview of the filmmaking process through a mixture of practical workshops, screenings, and talks by invited specialists working in film. How do you approach selecting the program and guest speakers for each edition of the film school?
So actually, since we wrote that text, we've kind of refocused again. I think as we go forward into the next few years, we'll probably have even less of the practical modules. Mostly for the reason that you said, it's so easy to learn to use a camera. You just pick it up, and in a couple of hours, you know what to do with it. So I wouldn't spend hours teaching people how to do that. But the curriculum, if you want to call it that, it's a mixture of things. Partly it's where the industry is at the moment. It's what are the prevailing concerns and challenges in the industry. So this year, because I've been involved in a lot of conversations about decolonizing filmmaking, decolonizing documentary film, decolonizing the film industry. So in other words, recentering it so that we don't just deify the same European film canon, and we acknowledge, particularly in documentary film, the history of colonialism in that industry. So the question then occurred to me, well, let's say we decolonize and we totally deconstruct the canon of narrative structure. What do we replace it with? And so we have to replace it with a new structure of our own making. Well, that making should be inspired by our cultural histories and our histories of narrative, in the same way that the three-act structure that was sort of formalized by Aristotle, it is a product of, and that has deeply influenced Western Europe's mode of storytelling, and that just became the dominant mode of storytelling in commercial cinema. But of course there are many other modes of storytelling. So what are they? And I started to look into my own cultural history in terms of storytelling from the Arab world, and that's why folklore for me became a major component of this year's film school, is so that people can find their own historical modes of storytelling. And for a lot of us, it's something as simple as, how were we told stories when we were young? I think our grandparents and our parents are, for most of us, the kind of primordial storytellers in our lives, and their ways of telling stories become how we conceive of structure, and that influences how we see the world. So it's not only a form of decolonizing film, but it's a very liberating experience to understand where your perception of reality comes from.
I have personally been following the updates you've been putting forward out on social media about the participants for the class of 2020 with great interest.
Oh, great.
You have an incredible lineup of participants for this year. I've read their biographies, and they come from all walks of life, all
Mhm.
backgrounds, all ethnicities. How do you handle participant selection for each edition of the film school, and what is the criteria by which you review and admit applicants?
Oh God, it's incredibly difficult. It's heartbreaking because there are so many enthusiastic, talented, passionate people who apply, and that the numbers you can take are very limited. I mean, this year in particular, so normally we can take about 18 people and we get about 70 applicants. This is when we hold the school physically in London. And this year we had 200 applications. So it's not, we've never had that many. We never expected that many. So it was even more difficult. The sort of strict criteria, there are very few. I mean, you need to be in the early stages. So, if you're already accomplished, that would you wouldn't really be eligible to apply. And you have to be available for all 5 days of the school. That's really it. I mean, there's very little else that would disqualify you. We tend to select people who wouldn't otherwise have opportunities like this. So, people who haven't been to a fee-paying film school, people who don't necessarily have a lot of postgraduate education in art, for example. And we definitely favor people from backgrounds that aren't well represented in the film industry. Other than that, it's just about, it's all, I feel almost like a police psychologist sometimes when I'm looking through these applications, because it's like you're trying to piece together a personality from all these clues, from their writing style to their work online, to the links they send you, whatever it might be, to the films they reference. And really it's just trying to make sure that they are people who would fit this ethos, which is in many ways very structureless. So that's where also part of the radical education comes from, and it's very much also influenced by Paulo Freire and the ideas of liberation through a kind of facilitated education. So they need to be people that we think will dig that kind of approach. People who don't just want to be, say, mainstream commercial filmmakers, because the work we focus on is not that kind of work. It's people who I think will enjoy the kind of irreverent, playful way that we run the sessions. They can be weird, they can be challenging, they can be confronting. It's people who I think will see something of themselves in the guests that we have. It's extremely difficult and painful, but it's kind of like selecting. It's almost like building a family from a list of names, on index cards, because when the participants are finished with the school, they really do become part of this family. We meet all the time. We have a very active Facebook group. We're always supporting each other's films. I help connect them with funders or producers or whoever it might be. They start making films with other participants from other years. Their work ends up in the gallery. Other people see them, and so it becomes this sort of peer support group. And for many of them, they're good friends now. They're supporters. They're advocates. They're comrades. And for me, I feel like, well, I don't know. I hate this. There's definitely a pastoral aspect to it. I know, I'm sure many of them find it very patronizing, but I do, I do feel like I'm helping to hold their hand through some of the more challenging parts of the industry.
Well, it is invaluable. And once again, I think what's so special about this film school is that everything that you share with your students comes from hard-earned experience yourself. You are a working filmmaker, and I think that brings a unique sort of perspective to what you have to share, and an informed perspective on what you have to share with the participants for your school. For those interested to learn more about the South London Gallery Film School, where do you suggest they go?
So we have I mean, there is a general description of the school online. Let me find exactly where it is. Yeah, it's southlondongallery.org. and then you should be able to find a reference to, it used to be called Recreative Film School. So all the previous years you'd find it referenced as Recreative Film School. Now it's just called SLG Film School. But I would sort of warn that part of the ethos of the school is also that it's very ephemeral. So there's very little documentation of it. It's designed to be immediate and experiential. There's no reading. There's a very little record of the modules and the events. And most of the information we don't publish just because it's a very private space for everyone to discuss film ideas, their lives, how they got to where they are, how their films reflect their fears and hopes and dreams. And we prefer it to not have the products of a more traditional film school, like published notes or a schedule online or records or minutes of the events.
Well, thank you for providing that perspective on where people can go to find information and what information is out there. Again, it's a credit to you and your team that you put some thought into how you would like to present the film school, where it can be found as far as public information is concerned. Saeed, it was a great honor to speak with you today on The Ask.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. It was mine.
I very much enjoyed hearing about your work on Strange Cities Are Familiar and your work on the South London Gallery. I very much hope to invite you back to this podcast. For those who are not aware, Saeed is also the director for a feature-length documentary called Tell Spring Not to Come This Year. It's a documentary about a unit within the Afghan National Army that deploys into the field to fight the Taliban. And it's easily one of the most dangerous assignments a journalist or filmmaker could take on, embedding with the Afghan National Army. Over the course of the last 2 decades, thousands of Afghan soldiers have lost their lives fighting the Taliban. And the fact that you went after this story 5 years ago is a testimony to your tenacity and courage. And I very much like to bring you back to the program at some point to discuss your work on that past documentary.
Yeah, I would love to. I'd love to.
Well, in that case, I'll look forward to connecting with you again. Saeed, thank you again for coming on The Ask.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.